The creation of Spider-Man involves three legendary creators: Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, and Steve Ditko. While it's generally acknowledged that Spider-Man is a co-creation of Lee and Ditko, Kirby was involved at an early stage. And in some interviews, Kirby has claimed the character was solely created by himself. So despite appearances, the creation of the world-famous Spider-Man is a bit more convoluted than one might expect. All three creators have their own versions concerning the evolution of the character and who created what. And, like with all eternal debates, there is little tangible evidence to fully support one side or another. It should be mentioned, the scope of this video is limited to Spider-Man's first appearance in Amazing Fantasy number 15. Any developments in the regular series are a topic for another day. Let's examine these claims and see what we can see. If you're new and you like what you see, please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. If you want to go a step further and directly support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon in the description. Jack Kirby's version of events needs a little context. For the majority of the 1960s, Kirby was instrumental in creating or co-creating the most well-known characters in the Marvel Universe. The complete list of characters and stories done by Kirby is impressive and immense. For at least the first 3 or 4 years of Marvel's existence, Kirby's fingerprints are practically on every character or series they published. It's reasonably safe to say, without Kirby's dedication and input, Stan Lee's effort to transform Marvel into a hip, viable publishing company might not have succeeded. At the same time, Kirby's efforts were not fairly rewarded. That is, he received credit for being an artist, and minimal, sometimes vague credit for plotting. The majority of the credit for all the characters that were created and the stories that were written went to Stan Lee. Because, as Kirby said, quote, "Well, I never wrote the credits," unquote. So given the fact that Kirby was very active in establishing early Marvel, his claims that he created Spider-Man cannot be immediately dismissed. The earliest instance I could find of Jack Kirby claiming he created Spider-Man was a 1982 interview with Will Eisner. This interview, published in The Spirit magazine, Kirby briefly states, quote, "Joe Simon and I had a strip, or a script called The Silver Spider. The Silver Spider was going into a magazine called Black Magic. Black Magic folded with the publisher Crestwood, and we were left with the script. I believe I said this could become a thing called Spider-Man, so the idea was already there when I talked to Stan," unquote. That same year, Kirby stated something similar in Comic Scene, quote, "I did a mess of things. The only book I didn't work on was Spider-Man, which Steve Ditko did, but Spider-Man was my creation," unquote. Infamously, in a 1990 interview with the Comics Journal, Kirby once again stated, quote, "I created Spider-Man. We decided to give it to Steve Ditko. I drew the first Spider-Man cover. I created the character. I created the costume," unquote. Now, in the course of doing research, I ran across a piece concerning this claim written by Tom Brevoort. It is an excellent summary that aligns with everything I had previously read. For a further, more detailed account, I highly recommend reading it. The bullet points are: Kirby's publishing partner, Joe Simon, created an unused character called the Silver Spider in the late 1950s. For the record, it was developed by Joe Simon, C.C. Beck, and Jack Oleck. A few pages and a script are available online. Kirby's involvement with Silver Spider, if he had any, was indirect or minimal. Regardless, the story was never published. The unpublished Silver Spider story was then transformed into a Spider-Man concept by Kirby and Simon, with Simon creating a logo. This Spider-Man, like the Silver Spider, also went unused. A few years later, Kirby and Simon created The Fly for Archie Comics. The Fly utilized the Silver Spider's origin and a few elements they intended for the Spider-Man concept. Notably, he was an orphan that comes into possession of a magic ring that transforms him into an adult superhero called the Fly. Again, we move forward a few years. In Kirby's version of events, during the early days of Marvel, he was the person pushing to add more superhero concepts. One such concept was Spider-Man, which he suggested to Lee. Lee then proposed the idea to the publisher, Martin Goodman, and it was approved. Kirby drew 5 pages of material, which Lee gave to Steve Ditko to be inked. Anecdotally, those pages contained one splash page of Kirby's Spider-Man design, and the rest were the origin of the character. In that Kirby version, Peter Parker was an orphan being raised by his aunt and uncle. One day, he comes into possession of a magic ring that transforms him into an adult superhero, Spider-Man. These pages, if they do exist, have never been discovered. It's possible they were either thrown away or otherwise destroyed, or they were taken by an unknown person and currently reside in someone's private collection. However, by all accounts, Kirby was the first to make an attempt at Spider-Man. This is not in dispute. What is in dispute is the level of contribution Kirby brought to Spider-Man. As a brief side note, as previously mentioned, the original Kirby Spider-Man pages have never been located. However, one image has appeared online that some suggest is one of these original drawings. It's not, it's a fake. In a post by Daniel Best, he debunks the image, stating it's a repurposed image of Giant Man from Tales to Astonish number 51. And, well, let's just say the evidence is compelling. When it comes to Stan Lee, his default approach when speaking, writing, or being interviewed was one of hyperbole, self-effacing charm, and showmanship for the sake of telling an engaging story. With all sincerity, he was a charming and intelligent man who revived a failing company, infused a dying genre with excitement, and who, seemingly, had nothing but fun creating four-color fantasies for the world to enjoy. His enthusiasm and manner were infectious. To greatly paraphrase something Steve Ditko once wrote, if you remove Lee from the equation that made Marvel successful, the odds of having the same success with another individual in Lee's place are functionally non-existent. Lee's sensibilities helped shape Marvel Comics in its formative years. Lee's accomplishments are indisputable, and he deserves credit for what he achieved. That being said, he repeatedly assumed credit for work he was not solely responsible for creating. And more often than not, he diminished the involvement of others while elevating his own. This, along with his showmanship style, is one of the major reasons why Lee's version of events is difficult to accept at face value. Which isn't to suggest it's entirely false, but it might not be as accurate as one might originally presume. Lee was more concerned with telling an engaging story that had dramatic embellishments, which was an approach that undermined any factual accuracy. According to Lee, the idea for Spider-Man was entirely his own, partially inspired by seeing a fly crawl up the wall while he was typing. Lee was also inspired by the Spider, a pulp and radio action hero who fought underworld crime. What he originally had in mind was a teenage superhero one the audience could identify with. He would be an unglamorous orphan nerd that lived with his aunt and uncle. And despite having superpowers, such as super strength and the ability to cling to walls, he'd deal with everyday relatable problems, like being unlucky with the ladies and having no money for basic needs. Unfortunately, the publisher, Martin Goodman, hated the idea of a teen superhero, and he disliked the Spider origin for the character even more. At the time Lee made this proposal, the comic, Amazing Adult Fantasy, which was primarily done by Lee and Steve Ditko, was being cancelled. Due to this, Lee got Goodman's approval to print the Spider-Man idea in the last issue, because if it failed to connect with an audience, it wouldn't matter, the title was already being cancelled. Lee then assigned Jack Kirby the task of creating the story and character design, and then assigning Steve Ditko the inking chores. Kirby then produced 5 pages of material. However, Lee thought Kirby's design didn't fit with his vision of a less muscular, spider-like nerd. Kirby was also busy doing everything else for Marvel, so Lee assigned Ditko the task of taking his vision for Spider-Man and making it real. Naturally, Ditko didn't disappoint, and the results were printed in the final issue of Amazing Fantasy, the cover to which was penciled by Jack Kirby and inked by Steve Ditko. Like the 2 prior creators, Steve Ditko was a massive talent. Unlike the 2 prior creators, Ditko avoided interviews or bringing any attention to his accomplishments. It wasn't modesty or humility that made him silent, it was his evolving adherence to objectivism. To be brief, due to his philosophical point of view, Ditko believed the quality of his work should speak for itself. It was unnecessary for him to elaborate concerning its merits or its meaning. This position seemed to extend to discussing anything publicly, especially interviews. Yet, Ditko did discuss some aspects of the industry in various essays, the majority of which are exceptionally difficult to locate. So his point of view concerning topics, such as the creation of Spider-Man, are reasonably obscure and not well represented, but they do exist. According to Ditko, his involvement with Spider-Man began when he was given 5 pages of Kirby artwork to ink. In my research, I could not determine why Ditko was chosen as the inker rather than one of Marvel's usual inkers, or someone more familiar with Kirby's style. I would speculate the most probable reason Lee chose Ditko was due to him being the regular penciler for Amazing Adult Fantasy. With Kirby drawing the Spider-Man story, this would be lost income for Ditko. So to compensate, Lee gave the inking job to Ditko. Perhaps a minor point to some, but it's a detail that stood out to me. Regarding these 5 pages, Ditko wrote in 2002, quote, "The splash page was the only one with a drawing of Spider-Man, a typical Kirby hero/action shot. The other 4 pages showed a teenager living with his aunt and uncle. The aunt was a kindly old woman, and the uncle was a retired police captain, hard, gruff, and he was down on the teenager. Next door, or somewhere in the neighborhood, there was a whiskered scientist type involved in some kind of experiment or project. The end of the 5 pages depicted the kid going towards the scientist's darkened house." Unquote. Ditko even supplied a drawing of what he recalled the Spider-Man looked like, as drawn by Kirby. After seeing these pages, Ditko remarked to Lee that Spider-Man was very similar to the Archie Comics character, The Fly. At some later point, Lee asked Ditko to do the Spider-Man story. Ditko was never informed why the change was being made, and he never speculated why Kirby's pages were not being used, although the implication is obvious. Ditko was given a synopsis by Lee to work from. From there, he designed all the characters. He created the costume design and expanded the story into 11 pages. For the record, Ditko also created the web shooters to replace the web gun and holster. Again, Ditko deferred speculation concerning whether the synopsis he was given was entirely written by Lee or whether it contained plot beats from Kirby. Regardless, Ditko took what he was given, broke it down, and brought it to life. Ditko also drew a cover for that issue. However, Lee rejected it and had Kirby draw a similar version from a different, more dynamic perspective. Ditko inked this cover. With that, the final published version of Spider-Man's origin was complete. Determining who created what, especially without any concrete proof, such as Kirby's original pages, Lee's original synopsis, and Ditko's script notes, is a difficult process. Everything is circumstantial. That being said, it would be hard to argue that Kirby created Spider-Man, at least not the version that was published in 1962. He may have created a version of Spider-Man with Joe Simon and another with Stan Lee, but neither version resembled the Spider-Man that saw print. It is possible that one element, an orphan living with his aunt and uncle, did originate with Kirby, and that may be the totality of his contribution. Although, one could argue, the web shooters were inspired by the web gun from Kirby's design. Another possible Kirby element is the ability to cling to walls. Whether that addition originated with Kirby or Lee is hard to discern. Regardless, even if all 3 elements could be attributed to Kirby, the end result was still quite different from what he envisioned. Continuing with Kirby's claim, the costume design was certainly Steve Ditko's. Not only does Ditko emphatically state this, but Lee doesn't mention Ditko using Kirby's design as a foundation for a new design. Stylistically, it could be argued it's in line with other Ditko designs from that era. So Kirby's statements that he created Spider-Man and he designed the costume are not well supported. As a side note, some may point out that Ditko's costume design bears a striking resemblance to a 1954 Halloween costume. Like many others, I would suggest this is a coincidence. Thematically, it only makes sense that a spider-based character would have a web design on their costume. As far as I can tell, Ditko never addressed this connection. And, considering Ditko's character, it's hard to believe he would intentionally steal a design or not acknowledge it as an influence. End of side note. As for who created what in the published version, it has to be noted that Ditko has never stated that he believes Spider-Man to be his sole creation. He has said that it is a co-creation between himself and Stan Lee. Ditko acknowledges that Lee had the idea, but he had to take that abstract spider concept and give it shape. Furthermore, Ditko took a 1 or 2 page synopsis and transformed it into 11 pages of story, adding what was necessary to hit all the dramatic beats. So, his involvement wasn't passive. What Ditko takes exception to, and where he and Lee disagree, is Lee undermining or downplaying Ditko's involvement. In 1986, Lee had this to say about crediting artists. Quote, "I think I've been very generous, because as I say, anywhere except the comic book business, the artist would not be considered a co-creator. The guy who says the idea, he's the creator. The guy who drew it is just drawing it after the creator told him to draw it." Unquote. It has to be noted, Lee was very generous with praise for the artists. That's well documented. But actual credit for co-creation? Not so much. It would be another decade before Stan Lee revised that opinion. Even then, he was non-specific and made declarations that were open to interpretation. In my opinion, Lee genuinely thought he was the sole creator. But after public pressure and criticism, he conceded the point, using language that protected Marvel from litigation. After all, considering an artist as a co-creator is not the same as blatantly stating the artist is a co-creator. There are other quotes from Lee, before and since, that underscore this point. However, to avoid being pedantic or coming off as a Stan Lee hater, I'm going to restrict it to one. The point has been made. Lee was not very good at acknowledging the collaborative nature of the medium, and he was consistent in that opinion through the years. Separately, both Kirby and Ditko objected to this position, and rightfully, they took offense that their contributions were diminished. In the end, who created Spider-Man and his iconic look? Kirby took a shot at it, but it was not to Lee's expectations, and it allegedly closely resembled a pre-existing character. Ditko took a shot with Lee's direction, and that resulted in the known character. So after weighing all the various arguments, the circumstantial evidence, and the potential influences, an accurate credit would be a co-creation between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. All that's left to say is thank you for watching, or listening, whatever the case may be. Thanks to all my fine supporters on Patreon and on YouTube. If you have the ways and means, please help out. I'm about a third of the way to my overall goal of being able to do this full time, so any and all support is greatly appreciated. Extra special thanks to Phil Sagan, Edward Clayton Andrews, Corey Drew, Alexa Zernish, Brian Deaton, Johnny Lim, Steve White, Taylor Dull, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient. Hey, look, a playlist. Why not watch some other videos? Until next time.